Hi, my name is Natalie Carter, 22 years old. Wearing the deep blue gown of the University of Michigan, I stepped onto the vast stadium in Ann Arbor, where thousands of students were embraced by their joyful families. The stands glittered with banners, roses, and cheers that roared like a festival. Yet, in the middle of that sea of people, where 3 seats should have been reserved for my family, there was only a cold, empty space. When the announcer called out, "Natalie Carter, Bachelor of Arts in Psychology," I walked onto the stage, my hands trembling as I held the diploma. Below the platform, camera flashes lit up endlessly, but none of them were directed at me. I walked down the steps to a wave of applause from strangers, with no familiar voices calling my name, no arms reaching to hold me. A moment that should have been the proudest of my life turned into nothing but a hollow performance, and I was merely a forgotten supporting character in my own story. This morning, I had woken up full of excitement, carefully doing my makeup and preparing for the ceremony. Then my phone buzzed, and a message from my mother cut through me like a cold blade. "Please understand, Vanessa just had a panic attack. We have to stay and calm her down." Just one blunt sentence, without an apology, without a word of encouragement. My sister, 25 years old, the one always called the family's golden daughter, had once again pulled my parents away from my life. I stared at the screen, hoping for another line to appear, something like, "We'll try to make it later," or "We're proud of you." But there was nothing. Only that single, cold message that ended every hope. Standing in the radiant stadium, I felt like an outsider. Around me, graduates laughed as they posed for photos with their parents, siblings, whole families wrapped around them like a warm embrace. I held my diploma, forced a stiff smile onto my face, and asked a classmate to take a few photos for me. In those pictures, I stood alone in the midst of a glowing crowd, my eyes trying to project pride, but my smile was so twisted that even I could hardly recognize myself. I walked out of the stadium while the crowd inside was still buzzing with excitement. The sun blazed down, the wind whipped the ribbons of decoration into the air, but all I felt was myself being pulled into an empty void. The day I had waited for over 4 years, the day meant to mark my growth and hard-earned effort, had turned into nothing more than another deep scratch across a heart already covered with cracks. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about their absence from a single ceremony. It was the truth I had tried to deny for years. In the Carter family, I had never been the priority. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family, as if all your efforts and emotions were never truly seen? If you have, let me know where you're watching this story from in the comments below so I'll know I'm not alone. I remember my childhood vividly, those years inside our house in Detroit where everything seemed to revolve around a single name: Vanessa. From the time I was little, my parents had stamped me with the label of being the strong, independent one. At first glance, it might sound like praise, but in reality, it was nothing more than an excuse to pour all their attention and affection onto my sister. Vanessa was the family's golden girl, the one my parents always considered fragile, delicate, someone who needed constant protection. I, on the other hand, was expected to sacrifice, to endure, and to always take care of myself. Every family meal seemed to revolve around Vanessa's mood. If she wanted a certain dish, that was what everyone ate. If she made a face and said the food was bland, my mother would immediately add more seasoning, or even order takeout just to please her. Many times, when I reached for the last piece of chicken, I would hear my father say, "Leave it for your sister. You don't need much, you're strong enough." And so I would quietly put it back, swallowing the lump in my throat. Even the rare family trips were arranged around Vanessa's schedule. Once, I wished we could visit the Grand Canyon, something I had studied in geography and longed to see with my own eyes. But in the end, the destination was changed to Los Angeles simply because Vanessa preferred the beach and wanted new photos for Instagram. I still remember sitting silently on the sand in Santa Monica, collecting seashells, while she posed for pictures, wondering if anyone in my family had ever truly listened to what I wanted. Birthdays, which were supposed to be the one day a child felt celebrated, were no exception. In my memories, they were always dazzling only for Vanessa. When she turned 15, my parents threw an extravagant party at an Italian restaurant with a live band, balloons strung across the venue, and guests filling every seat. When I turned 15, my birthday was marked by a small cake hastily bought from a nearby bakery, the candle lit and blown out in less than 5 minutes. Because my parents were rushing to drive Vanessa to a rehearsal for her school play. They told me, "We'll make it up to you next year." But that next year never came. When I was 16, I won the state science scholarship, a prize my teachers said was nearly impossible for any student to achieve. I carried the certificate home, my heart racing, hoping for at least a word of praise or a warm embrace. But my parents only glanced at it, set it down on the table, and said, "Good, you've always been smart. That's nothing unusual." Then they turned immediately to ask Vanessa about the number of likes on her latest photo. She proudly announced she had over 3,000, and that very night the whole family went out to celebrate her Instagram achievement. I sat there, biting my lip, listening to the clinking glasses and cheerful laughter, feeling as though my chest was being crushed. The scholarship I had spent countless nights working toward wasn't even worth a mention, while one trivial picture from Vanessa was enough for a full celebration. The constant comparisons became wounds that reopened again and again. I kept hearing the same refrain. "You don't need much, save it for your sister. She's weaker, she needs more care." They used my resilience as an excuse to neglect me, as a justification not to give me the tenderness every child deserves. Over time, I learned to swallow my feelings, to stay silent, and to become the child who never asked for anything. I was always the one giving up the nicer room, the better meal, even the rare moments of recognition from my parents. And worst of all, I convinced myself that it was normal, that if I just stayed patient a little longer, one day they would finally see my worth. But that day never came. The favoritism stretched from the smallest things to the biggest milestones of life. When Vanessa failed her college entrance exam, she cried for a week, and my parents immediately hired an expensive tutor and arranged the paperwork so she could enroll in a private school. Meanwhile, when I was struggling to prepare for the SAT, I had to study alone, dig through online resources, and push myself without any help. My parents always said, "You're independent, you'll be fine." They spoke as though independence were a gift, but in reality, it was just a reason for them to leave me behind at the very moment I needed them most. I grew up with a silent belief that I was nothing more than a shadow behind the spotlight my parents had built for Vanessa. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I achieved, my success was never big enough to break through that invisible wall. Over time, I came to understand that in my parents' eyes, I was only the strong child, the one who doesn't need care. But that very label carved a wound deep inside me. One I didn't fully recognize until years later, when they abandoned me on my graduation day. By then, the wound had split into a fracture too wide to ever be repaired. That night, as the stadium lights faded and the echoes of celebration died away, I carried my bachelor's degree back to my small apartment. The room greeted me with a suffocating silence, dark and still. I laid my cap and gown on the desk, my hands trembling as though I had just lost something I could never recover. In that moment, I told myself that at the very least, a comforting message from my parents would be enough to soften the pain. I unlocked my phone, my heart pounding with the last fragile thread of hope. The screen lit up with 2 short messages, so cold and detached that I had to read them over and over to believe they were real. The first was from my mother. "Sorry, honey. Vanessa had a breakdown after fighting with her boyfriend. You understand." The second came from my father. "We'll celebrate another day." Just 2 sentences, no congratulations, no words of pride, not even the slightest acknowledgement of the moment I had waited 4 years for. Every effort, every sleepless night spent writing essays, every hour of anxiety before exams, every tear shed in silence. All of it was reduced to a hollow apology and an empty promise. I collapsed onto the bed, clutching my phone as if it were the only thing holding me together, feeling like the entire world had turned its back on me. In my head, a question echoed one I had avoided for 22 years. Why was I always the second choice, or worse, not even a choice at all? I thought back to all the times I had tried to impress them, desperate for my parents to notice me. From the state science scholarship at 16, to the university research award, to the nights I worked extra shifts just to pay my own tuition, all of it had been brushed aside, dismissed as expected, because I was independent. Meanwhile, my sister Vanessa only had to shed a few tears over a trip that didn't go her way, a broken relationship, or a photo that didn't get enough likes. And my parents would drop everything to console and protect her. In that moment, I realized the unfairness I had endured wasn't just a family habit, it had been an invisible sentence hanging over me for 22 years. And as I stared at my phone, rereading those two detached messages, I finally understood that my graduation had never been important in their eyes. It was nothing more than a minor event they were willing to discard in order to tend to one of Vanessa's tempers. I sank into my pillow, tears spilling hot down my cheeks. I hated myself for hoping things might be different, for convincing myself that today would finally make them see me in a new light. In the darkness, I could hear the pounding of my own heart, each beat crashing against my chest like a warning. This was the breaking point, the final drop that made the glass overflow. I no longer had the strength to keep being the obedient, patient daughter, endlessly waiting for love from people who had never considered me important in the first place. My phone kept lighting up with notifications from friends. "Congratulations, Natalie. So proud of you. You really shone today." I read each one, feeling both warmth and bitterness. Strangers remembered to celebrate me, while my parents and sister, the very people I had hoped for most, vanished as if I didn't exist. I set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, and in that moment my whole childhood and the years of growing up replayed like a film in reverse. The meals I had to give up, the holidays I had to step aside for, the awards ignored, the hidden tears. And now, all of it had come crashing down on a day that should have been the happiest of my life. I sat up, took a deep breath, and faced a painful truth. In my parents' eyes, I was not pride, not priority, but simply the backdrop that allowed them to keep worshipping Vanessa. This injustice was no longer a series of small slights, it had become a wound bleeding quietly inside me for 22 years. And that night, in the silence of my dorm room, I knew my endurance had reached its limit. I could no longer live as the extra child. The next morning, I drove back to the house in the suburbs of Detroit, the place where I had grown up for 22 years, yet had never truly belonged. The familiar road lined with summer maples no longer gave me the sense of peace it once had. I pulled up in front of the garage, took a long breath, and stepped inside. The sound of the television carried from the living room, so familiar it made my throat tighten. But, inside me, the anger from the night before still burned fiercely, pushing me to finally confront them once and for all. My parents sat on the sofa while Vanessa lounged cross-legged in the armchair, dressed in a pale pink satin pajama set, her face lightly made up even though it was morning. The sight of it made my throat tighten last night. I had stood alone before thousands, while here they were, tending to her over some meaningless tantrum. I stood at the doorway, my voice trembling but firm. "College graduation only happens once. You skipped mine just because she was crying?" The air in the room froze instantly. My father looked up, his brow furrowed. "Natalie, don't start with that attitude. You have to understand, yesterday was awful for Vanessa." Vanessa immediately sighed, placing a hand over her chest as if she had survived some terrible ordeal. "I had a fight with my boyfriend. Do you know how painful that feels?" Her voice quivered, her eyes shimmering with tears as though a single blink would send them falling. "If you had a heart, you would understand why Mom and Dad had to stay with me." Istala here, anger erupting. "And what about my heart? My graduation, the one day that comes only once in 4 years, why didn't anyone think of me? Why are her feelings always more important than everything else, while I'm never even considered?" My mother cut in, her tone soft but laced with reproach. "Natalie, you're being selfish. Family means sacrificing for one another. Vanessa is more fragile than you. You're strong, you're independent, you should understand." I laughed bitterly, the sound echoing through the room, leaving the three of them stunned. "Strong? Independent? That's not a compliment, it's just the excuse you've used to neglect me for 22 years. Every time there's a conflict, you choose her. Every joy has to revolve around her. No matter how hard I've tried, it's never meant anything in your eyes. Vanessa furrowed her brows, her voice feigning softness but dripping with disdain. You always think of yourself as the victim. You have no idea the pressure I'm under. I'm the one expected to succeed, to look perfect, to be happy. One bad day for me is worth more of the family's concern than some ceremony you can just watch again on video. My fists clenched so tightly my nails dug into my skin as I struggled to contain the rage boiling inside me. What did you just say? That one bad day of yours is more important than a milestone I'll never live again. Do you even hear yourself? My father slammed his hand down on the table, his tone heavy and final. That's enough, Natalie. You're blowing this out of proportion. We'll celebrate later, so what's the big deal? You need to learn to think about the family. My mother nodded in agreement. Exactly. Would you really let one ceremony make you dismiss your family's love? You should know how to yield. Yield. That word cut into me like a knife. Memories came flooding back, the last slice of cake I had to give up for Vanessa, the family vacation rerouted for Vanessa, the awards forgotten because of Vanessa. While I swallowed my tears and pretended it was fine, this time I couldn't stay silent. My voice broke into sobs, echoing through the room like thunder. For 22 years, I've yielded enough. I have never been put first, never been valued. I've only been a shadow in this house, existing solely to let her shine. The room fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of my own choked sobs. I stared into their eyes, but there was no warmth left, only a terrifying sense of distance. Vanessa lowered her head, yet the faint curl of a smug smile lingered on her lips. My parents avoided my gaze, as if the truth I had just spoken was too heavy for them to face. But I already knew the answer that had been clear in their hearts all along. I had never been chosen, never been a priority, and I would never be their pride. The echo of my outburst was still hanging in the living room when the front door suddenly swung open. My parents flinched, and Vanessa's head snapped up, her face paling instantly. Standing at the threshold was my grandfather Richard Evans, tall and lean, but steady, clad in his familiar beige khaki coat. Though now well into his 70s, once a renowned lawyer in Grand Rapids, the sharpness in his eyes and the firmness of his steps carried a weight that demanded respect. His gaze swept across the room, lingering on my tear-streaked face and my parents' uneasy expressions, before he spoke in a low, commanding voice. "What's going on here?" No one answered. The room sank into a tense stillness, the ticking of the clock the only sound. I drew in a long breath, the tears still burning hot on my cheeks, and in that moment, I knew I could no longer remain silent. This was my only chance to tell it all, to strip bare the truth I had buried for 22 years. I turned to my grandfather, my voice trembling but fierce. "Grandpa, I can't take it anymore. Since I was a child, I've always had to give in, always been treated like an outsider. My birthdays were never celebrated properly, while Vanessa's were always grand. When I earned a scholarship, my parents barely looked at it before setting it aside, but if Vanessa posted a single photo, the whole family went out to celebrate. And now, even my graduation, the most important moment of my life, they abandoned me just because she had a fight with her boyfriend and cried." I spoke without pausing, each word tearing at my throat. Every memory that spilled out was like a knife twisting in my chest, but I kept going, because my grandfather needed to know everything, without a single detail left behind. I have tried my best to be the pride of this family, but never once have they seen me. I am just a shadow. I am just the girl who has to sacrifice so that she can shine. My voice broke, my hands clenched so tightly the knuckles turned white. My grandfather stood still for several seconds, his face shifting from shock to a grave heaviness. Finally, he turned to my parents, his gaze sharp as a blade. "What Natalie just said, is it true?" My father swallowed hard, while my mother quickly folded her hands together, her voice trembling. "Dad, it's not the way she makes it sound. I only wanted peace in the house. She's fine, really. But Vanessa is more fragile, she needs us more. Her words trailed off, sounding less like an explanation and more like a weak excuse. My grandfather closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again, his gaze harsher than I had ever seen. Do you know something? For the past 5 years, I've been the one quietly paying the mortgage on this house. I've been the one keeping your small business from collapsing. Every month, I sent money with the belief that you were raising both of these girls fairly, that Natalie was being loved and cared for just as much as Vanessa. He paused, his voice slow but heavy with disappointment. But today, I see that trust has been betrayed. The entire room seemed to collapse. My parents sat frozen, their faces pale with shock. My heart pounded wildly as the realization hit me our family's financial stability all these years hadn't come from my parents' efforts, but from my grandfather quietly standing behind us. Vanessa was the only one to break the silence, and, as always, she believed she could twist the situation with her false fragility. "Grandpa," she said sweetly, with a hint of reproach. "You don't understand. My mental health is very important. If Natalie had her graduation yesterday while I was suffering, I would have completely fallen apart. Shouldn't the family prioritize my emotional well-being? A graduation can always be replayed on video, but my feelings— Enough, Vanessa." My grandfather's voice cut through her words, deep and resolute, silencing her instantly. "You are 25 years old, no longer a child who can wield tears as a weapon. Do you even hear what you just said? You believe your heartbreak over a boyfriend leaving you is more important than your sister's milestone of becoming an adult? You think the whole world should revolve around you." His face was so stern that even my parents dared not speak. Then he turned to me, his aged eyes sharp yet filled with compassion. "Natalie, I am sorry for letting you endure this for so long. I should have seen it sooner." He shifted his gaze back to my parents, his voice striking like a gavel on the table. "From this day forward, I am cutting off all support. You will take care of your own lives. I will no longer enable this injustice and deceit." The room sank into a deadly silence. My parents sat in shock, while Vanessa's mouth hung open, her face stripped of its usual confidence. I stood there, my chest rising and falling, torn between pain and relief. A part of me felt shattered, but another part felt free. For the first time in my life, the truth had been spoken aloud, and for the first time, I wasn't carrying it all alone. Before I could even gather myself, my grandfather turned fully toward me, his gaze softening. His voice lowered, steady and warm, yet resolute. "Natalie, would you like to come live with me? My home in Grand Rapids will always have a place for you. You don't need to endure this injustice any longer." Oh, one. Hearing those words, my whole body trembled. For years, I had longed for someone to see me, to understand me, to offer me a way out. Now, it was truly happening. I nodded, tears streaming uncontrollably, each drop burning against my cheeks. "Yes, Grandpa, I want to." The words left my lips like a release. I was crying as I spoke, but this time, the tears weren't just from pain, they carried a spark of hope, a light finally breaking through the darkness. Immediately, my parents jumped to their feet, panic etched across their faces. My father rushed forward, his voice urgent. "Dad, you can't do this. If you take her away, how are we supposed to survive? The company is struggling, this house is still under the bank's loan, we need your support." My mother's voice shook as she followed, tears brimming in her eyes, though not for me, but for the looming loss of their monthly lifeline. "Dad, we know we've been unfair at times, but it's not as bad as she makes it sound. I just wanted peace in the house. Please don't cut us off, we're begging you." I stood there, listening to every word of their desperate pleading, and a cold bitterness rose inside me. Not once did they beg me to stay. Not once did they plead out of fear of losing their youngest daughter. They cried and begged my grandfather only because they feared losing the money. That truth hit me like a final blow, shattering every last illusion I had about family love. I wiped my tears, but this time it was so I could see clearly, so I could etch it deep into memory. They did not regret abandoning me, they only regretted the thought of losing their financial lifeline. My grandfather raised his hand, silencing all their excuses. Enough. I trusted you for 5 years, and in return I received nothing but deceit. You do not deserve another cent. From this day forward, take care of yourselves. His voice struck through the room like a gavel in a courtroom, absolute and undeniable. I turned away, unwilling to hear another word. Upstairs, I pulled out the old suitcase that had been tucked in the corner of my closet since high school. Each item I placed inside carried a sting of pain but also a strange lightness. A few sets of clothes, my laptop, the thick journal I had filled over the years, a handful of my favorite books. I looked around the room that had been mine for 22 years, the pale blue walls, the worn desk, the window where I used to sit watching the rain, wishing for a real family. Now I was leaving, not with regret, but with freedom. Downstairs, the sound of arguments still echoed. My parents continued pleading with my grandfather, while Vanessa sat in silence, her face pale, her eyes red not from sorrow for me, but from realizing that this time, her tears no longer carried any weight. I closed my suitcase and pulled the zipper shut, the sharp sound slicing through the air like a declaration. I was ready. When I descended the stairs, my grandfather was already waiting, his gaze steady and unwavering. My parents rushed toward us, but not to stop me, they clung to my grandfather instead. Dad, please, think about this. If Natalie leaves, the neighbors will talk, they'll say we failed to raise our daughter. Don't do this. Their words made me let out a bitter laugh. Even now, they cared more about appearances than about their own child. I rolled my suitcase to my grandfather's side and lifted my head high, feeling as though I had just broken free from a cage that had trapped me for far too long. My grandfather placed his hand firmly on my shoulder and said in a low, steady voice, "Let's go, Natalie. I'm taking you home." Together, we turned and walked away, leaving behind the pleas and the hollow sobs. My parents called my name, but in their voices there was no love, only panic at the thought of losing the money that had sustained them. I didn't look back. The door slammed shut behind me like a final period at the end of 22 years spent living as a shadow. That night, I sat in my grandfather's car with the suitcase resting in the back seat. The streetlights of Detroit cast their glow across his face, illuminating the deep lines of age but also the sharp, unwavering brightness in his eyes. He looked at me through the rearview mirror, giving a slight nod. "You've been very brave, Natalie. This should have happened long ago." I leaned my head against the window, tears rolling down my cheeks, but this time they didn't taste of bitterness. Instead, I felt light, as if I had just stepped out of a suffocating dark room and breathed in the air of freedom for the first time. The house behind me, the place I once called family, was now nothing more than a cruel memory. I knew that from this night forward, my life was turning to a new page. Life at my grandfather's house began like a fresh wind filling lungs that had been suffocating for too long. The spacious home in Grand Rapids carried an atmosphere entirely different from the tense house in Detroit. Here, everything was quiet, warm, and most importantly, I no longer felt the need to measure every word or movement to avoid upsetting someone. In Grand Rapids, I no longer walked on trembling feet, no longer lived in constant fear of someone else's moods. Each morning, my grandfather and I had breakfast in the sunlit kitchen, he with his newspaper, and I preparing for school. In the evenings, we often sat on the porch, watching the Michigan sky stretch wide with the colors of sunset, talking about plans for the future. When I received my acceptance letter into the graduate program in psychology at Michigan State University, along with a partial scholarship, my grandfather was the first person I threw my arms around, overwhelmed with joy. "You deserve this, Natalie," he said, his eyes shining as if he himself had earned the achievement. "I'll take care of the rest. Just fly as high as you can." In that moment, I knew I had finally found the anchor I had been missing my entire life. At graduate school, I slowly discovered what true friendship felt like. No one compared me to Vanessa. No one dismissed or overlooked my efforts. We studied in groups, stayed up all night writing papers, and shared every moment of pressure and triumph together. For the first time, I felt myself stepping out of the invisible shadow and being recognized for my own worth. Whenever I told my friends stories about my grandfather, they admired him deeply. And I realized then that sometimes family isn't the people who share your blood, but the ones who truly see you, understand you, and choose to walk beside you. But that peace didn't last long. Just a few days after I moved out, my phone began buzzing nonstop. Texts and calls from my parents flooded in, filled with apologies that sounded sweet on the surface but hollow underneath. "Natalie, we know we were wrong. We're family, come back home. Don't make your grandfather angry anymore." Then another. "I'm sorry, honey. I wasn't thinking clearly that day. Vanessa is fragile. I was afraid she might do something foolish." My father even called once in the middle of the night, his voice hoarse. "You're our flesh and blood. Are you really going to abandon us?" It didn't take me long to understand. None of these words came from love. They were nothing but tactics to pull me back, to make me soften, and to persuade my grandfather to restore the financial support they had lost. Each time my screen lit up with Mom or Dad, I felt a wave of weariness. I thought back to my graduation night, walking across the stage to the applause of thousands, yet utterly alone, the only message from them a cheap excuse to cover for Vanessa. I knew clearly then, they weren't missing me, they were missing the money my grandfather had sent. Still, I didn't want to stay silent. A part of me wanted to test them, to see if they could, just once in their lives, choose me over Vanessa. So in one reply, I wrote, "I'll consider coming back only if Vanessa moves out on her own. She's 25, she has a job, she has income. There's no reason for her to still cling to you. If you truly want me to return, let her stand on her own." How so? I knew that condition was like pressing a knife to their throats, because my parents had never been willing to let Vanessa face the slightest hardship. But I never intended to return. This was only a test. I wanted to see their reaction, to know once and for all. Was there ever a place for me in their hearts, or had it always been, and would always be, only Vanessa? After sending that message, I set my phone down, no longer trembling with fear as I once had. In fact, I felt a quiet sense of calm, because I knew I had finally drawn a boundary. If they chose Vanessa, it would confirm everything I had endured for 22 years. And if, by some miracle, they chose me, maybe I would believe there was still a flicker of hope left for our family. But deep down, I already knew the answer. In the days that followed, my phone fell into an eerie silence. No more floods of messages, no more relentless calls. That silence was its own reply, and it carried both pain and release. In that quiet, I realized something with absolute clarity. I had stopped waiting, stopped hoping. I no longer needed them, no longer longed for validation from people who had never once placed me first. I had my grandfather, I had a home, and most importantly, I had myself. One evening, as my grandfather and I sat on the back porch watching the sunset paint the Grand Rapids sky red, he placed his hand gently over mine and spoke in his calm, steady voice. "Natalie, I know you've endured more than your share. But I am proud of you for standing up, for setting your own terms. That's not selfishness, it's self-respect." I nodded, my eyes stinging with tears. For the first time in my life, I felt truly valuable, not because of academic achievements, not because of carrying heavy burdens, but simply because I was me. I lifted my eyes to the sky as it deepened into shades of violet, thinking about the life ahead. There would be hardships, there would be challenges, but at least I knew I had cut the heavy chains that bound me for so many years. I was no longer a shadow, but an independent person finally beginning to discover my true worth. And inside, I whispered to myself, I will never go back, never. One late summer afternoon, after my last class of the day, I walked out of the building with a heavy backpack slung over my shoulder. Golden sunlight stretched across the campus, students spilling out in laughter and chatter. I was about to head toward the parking lot when I froze. By the school gate, beneath the wide branches of a great oak, a familiar figure stood, arms crossed, sunglasses covering half her face. Even in her attempt to disguise herself, I recognized her instantly. Vanessa. My chest tightened, a bad premonition rising within me. I slowed my steps, considering turning away, but her voice cut sharply across the noise of the crowd. "Natalie, we need to talk." Students nearby turned their heads, some whispering to each other. I swallowed hard, then decided to face her instead of running. I had sworn to myself that I would never again let Vanessa trample me. As I walked closer, she pulled off her glasses, her cold eyes locking onto mine. "You really are selfish. Mom and Dad are nearly losing their minds because of you. Why would you set such a ridiculous condition? You knew they could never make me move out, but you forced them to choose anyway. Do you really want to tear this family apart?" Her voice rang high and sharp, deliberately loud enough for everyone around to hear. I felt the curious stares closing in, but instead of trembling like before, I answered calmly. "If you recall, that exact line was why you stole my graduation from me. You said if you weren't happy, then I couldn't be happy either. Now, I'm only giving back exactly what you sowed." Vanessa's face flushed red, her lips pressed tight and trembling with fury. You dare compare that to this ridiculous condition? I'm the one carrying the pressure. I'm the one who needs protection. And you're always pretending to be the victim." I smirked, the bitterness inside me hardening into something stronger. "You're right. I was the victim for 22 years, but not today. I won't let anyone, not even you, decide my worth ever again." Perhaps it was the calm in my voice that pushed Vanessa over the edge. She suddenly screamed and lunged at me, hands outstretched to shove hard. I stepped back, but this time I didn't yield. My hand shot forward, pushing back with enough force to make her stumble and nearly fall. The students around us froze, some gasping aloud. Years of pent-up suppression surged through me, and I was no longer the timid girl who endured in silence. I met her eyes squarely, my voice sharp as steel. "Don't ever think I'll stay quiet and let you do whatever you want." Vanessa shrieked again, this time reaching to grab my hair, but a group of my classmates quickly intervened. "Hey, what's wrong with her? Calm down." One boy pulled Vanessa back while a girl held me by the arm. My breathing came fast, my heart pounding, but beneath it was a surge of fierce satisfaction. For the first time, I hadn't backed down. For the first time, I had forced Vanessa to stop in her tracks before my resistance. Vanessa thrashed, trying to break free, spitting curses. "Traitor. You just want to tear this family apart. You'll regret this." But her voice grew shrill, out of place among the disapproving stares of the crowd. A few students raised their phones to record the scene. I caught the flicker of fear in Vanessa's eyes. She had always been obsessed with maintaining a flawless image on social media, and now, here at the school gates, that image was crumbling before everyone's eyes. I took one step forward, staring directly at the sister who had been the nightmare of my childhood. My voice was steady, each word carved into the ground like stone. "Vanessa, you've taken too much from me already. But this ends here. If you ever lay a hand on me again, I will call the police. And this time, you will be held accountable." With that, I turned my back on her without another glance, leaving Vanessa pinned in place under the weight of the crowd's judging eyes. On the way to the parking lot, my friends hurried after me, checking if I was all right, some patting my shoulder in quiet support. I forced a smile, though inside my chest was still heaving with a storm. That confrontation wasn't just another fight, it was a turning point. I had stood up for myself. I had proven that I was no longer the weak shadow within the Carter family. Vanessa could scream, she could curse, but the truth was that she had just been humiliated in front of everyone. And for me, that was the first real victory in reclaiming my worth. After such a fierce showdown at the school gates, I thought Vanessa would disappear for a while, or at least that my parents would try to smooth things over to save face. But only a few days later, while I was sitting in the library preparing for an essay, my phone buzzed again. A long message appeared on the screen, from the familiar group thread, Mom and Dad Family Group. My chest tightened with both curiosity and unease as I opened it. The first line hit me like a slap. "We've thought long and hard, and we choose Vanessa. You've become too cruel, Natalie. Don't ever come back." I froze, my eyes glued to the screen. The words that followed cut even deeper. All the effort we put into raising you is wasted. You are ungrateful, selfish, and only know how to cause division. We don't need a daughter like you anymore." Each sentence was like an icy knife, yet strangely, I didn't feel like I was about to shatter as I once would have. Instead, a strange emptiness spread through me, and then slowly transformed into a calm so steady it surprised even me. I read that message over and over. They weren't even trying to hide their choice. They declared outright that Vanessa was the priority, and I was nothing more than a burden, a waste. In that moment, I understood this was the final answer to the 22 years I had spent waiting. I had once believed that maybe one day they would realize, they would change, they would look at me with pride. But no, the truth was, they had never intended to choose me, and now they had finally said it out loud. I set the phone down on the desk and drew in a long breath. Memories came flooding back: my 15th birthday with a tiny, quiet cake, the state scholarship that was ignored, and the hollow emptiness of my college graduation. All the times I had forced a smile, telling myself to be strong, convincing myself that if I just endured a little longer, I would be seen. But today's message was the final verdict. I didn't have to keep trying for them anymore. The phone buzzed again, more messages piling in, each longer and harsher than the last. "You've torn this family apart. You're selfish, cruel, only thinking of yourself. If your grandfather knew what you were really like, he'd be disappointed too." I stared at the words, and instead of pain, I felt a strange kind of amusement. They were still trying to manipulate me one last time, using guilt and fear to bind me, the way they had for years. But this time, I was no longer the small, enduring Natalie. I finally saw them for what they were. I opened the settings on my phone, scrolled down to the block list. My hand pressed each button firmly, without a second of hesitation. Blocked every number. Blocked every email. Blocked the family group thread. When the final button was pressed, the screen went dark, silent at last. And in that silence, I felt a weight lift of freedom, as though I had cut through the chain that had been strangling me for far too long. I sat still for a few minutes, and then a profound truth washed over me. Being cut off by them wasn't a loss, it was freedom. I hadn't lost parents, because they were never truly my support to begin with. I hadn't lost a family, because that family had always been nothing more than a facade built around Vanessa. What I had blocked was only an illusion I had clung to for 22 years, a dream of love that had never existed. I stood up and walked out of the library. The golden glow of sunset spilled across the campus, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. I drew in a deep breath, feeling as if I had been reborn. My phone lay silent in my pocket, but my heart pounded with a new certainty that from now on, I would live my own life, no longer chained by their toxic favoritism. That evening, sitting on the porch with my grandfather, I told him everything. He only nodded softly, his eyes filled with pride and a trace of sorrow. "Natalie, sometimes blood family isn't the place where you'll find love and respect, but you had the courage to step away, and that's what matters. You're free now." I smiled, warmth spreading through me. He was right. I had lost one family, but at the same time, I had found a real one, beginning with my grandfather and with myself. In the months that followed, after I had blocked every line of contact with my parents and Vanessa, I was slowly building a new life. Meanwhile, in Detroit, the Carter family they had so proudly flaunted to neighbors began spiraling into collapse. After my grandfather cut all financial support, my parents' small accounting firm couldn't hold out much longer. Contracts dried up, employees left one by one, and eventually, the company went bankrupt. The house that once glowed with lights during Vanessa's parties grew cold and silent, a for sale sign planted in the front yard like an epitaph to the so-called perfect family. Bye. I heard from a few old acquaintances that my parents were slowly being shunned by the neighbors. People whispered about their favoritism, about how they had lost the trust of their own kin. The Carter family, once mentioned as a model household in the neighborhood, was now nothing more than a subject of pity and gossip. Vanessa, who had always lived sheltered and dependent, was eventually forced to move out and fend for herself. I wasn't sure how she managed, only that her social media posts became fewer and fewer, no longer filled with glamorous images but replaced with vague complaints. Some said she had found a regular job, nothing like the luxury she flaunted before. When I heard this, I simply smiled. It wasn't joy at someone else's suffering, it was a long-delayed fairness, life finally forcing them to face the reality I had endured long ago. Time passed, and I grew stronger in my new life. Whenever stress from coursework weighed me down, I remembered my grandfather's words. Don't forget, you don't have to prove yourself to anyone. You study because you want to, because of your own worth. That unwavering trust was the guiding light that carried me through each challenge. And then, at last, the important day arrived, my graduate school commencement. That morning, I slipped into the deep green gown of Michigan State University, adjusting the cap carefully. As I entered the auditorium, the music swelled, but this time my heart wasn't heavy like it had been 4 years earlier. I glanced toward the audience and immediately found my grandfather's eyes. He sat proudly in the front row, holding a bright bouquet of sunflowers. Beside him were the close friends I had shared my graduate years with, each waving signs with my name, cheering at the top of their lungs. I smiled, my eyes blurring with emotion, when the announcer's voice rang out. Natalie Carter, Master of Arts in Psychology. I walked across the stage to the sound of thunderous applause. But unlike before, this time I truly felt surrounded, truly seen. I was no longer the daughter standing silently in a crowd before 3 cold, empty seats. I was myself, Natalie Carter, who had stood up, stepped out of the shadows, and found her real family. I accepted my degree, bowed in gratitude, then turned and smiled at my grandfather. That smile was no longer strained, no longer bitter, but the smile of freedom and happiness. In that moment, I knew I had completed the journey. From a child overlooked in her own home, to a woman grown, free, and secure in her own worth. When the ceremony ended, I stood among my friends and my grandfather, surrounded by laughter and voices of joy. And in my heart, I sent out a message to anyone listening to this story. Sometimes, to find your true worth, you must dare to let go of blood ties and seek the family you choose. I lost one family, but I also found a real one. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.